Hello. I would like to talk to you today about the philosophy of George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. And specifically, I'd like to talk to you about some of his ideas around the nature of art and aesthetic theory. This is kind of a tricky thing to do. Hegel is notoriously inaccessible as a thinker. His writing is turgid, it is impenetrable, and it is deeply, deeply systematic. And that's unfortunate because this guy has an enormous amount of insight. I mean, he is, I think, one of the most influential thinkers of the 19th century, even if he's lost a little bit of cachet in the 20th century. And his ideas have an enormous amount of power to offer to them. So, if he's an important guy to understand, but he is more than just a little bit difficult to read, how are we supposed to approach that? What are we going to do about that? Well, here's what I propose. As much as this guy is really hard to digest in many ways, I don't think that the gist of Hegel is all that hard to get. And this is why he's had so much impact in the 19th century. What I'd like to do is I'd like to get at some of the central concepts in Hegel. I'm not going to give a thorough analysis of what they mean, but I do want to give a sense of how one might take them, how to approach them. And from that, we can begin to see how you might apply these ideas to his notions of art and aesthetic theory, and see what some of those insights I'm so excited about are. So, to begin. Well, where does one start with Hegel? I guess there are a number of cornerstone terms that he has: dialectic, history, idea. But if there's a place I would start, it would probably be with the notion of rationality. What is rationality for Hegel? Well, let me say a little about what it's not. A lot of times when you think about the word rationality, I find people sort of make an association of dry, almost mathematical reasoning. They think of Mr. Spock from Star Trek. They think of thinking without any sort of emotion. This isn't. I don't think this is exclusive of it doesn't preclude what Hegel's saying, but it's not really what he's got in mind either. Um, when Hegel talks about rationality, he's talking more about, if you like, rationality, that is, proportions and ratios between concepts. And the reason why he's doing that is because for Hegel, the nature of identity is fundamentally rational, not just rational, but rational. Let me explain. Let's take a very simple, or seemingly simple concept, like the concept white. Okay, so the color, or shade, I guess it is, white. Now, if I ask you a question like, well, what exactly is it that makes white white? You probably say, well, I always thought that white was white because it's white and it has whiteness, and that's what makes it white. And that's about all I got to say about it. That's not unreasonable. But when Hegel talks about white, he'd say, well, there's a couple of things to consider about it. Yeah, there's the immediate, what he would call concrete qualities of it, just the way in which you encounter the properties of whiteness. So brightness, holding all the colors, things like that. And that's certainly part of it. But that's on the surface, because the other thing that Hegel recognizes, he says, well, yeah, there's what you perceive with white, but there's also what you associate whiteness with. There's moral and aesthetic things you associate it with. Goodness, purity, possibility, illumination, reflection, all sorts of different things like that. And what Hegel wants to say is, how is that possible? How does this concept get hooked up into all these other different things? What's the mechanism that happens with? Well, he'll say, here's the thing. Something like white doesn't just have these concrete qualities inside of them. White is what it is also because it is not its opposite. That is, white is white not just simply because it has the concrete qualities of being white, but also because it's not black. Now, again, you might say, okay, that's still kind of obvious, but here's the thing that comes from this. Hegel says that everything that has an identity has its identity in terms of that dynamic opposition between things. So white is white both by being white concretely and not being black. Black is black in the way that it is both by having the concrete qualities of black and not being white. And the two are in this dynamic opposition. That is, the identities are struggling with one another. They're trying to contradict one another in some sense. Maybe trying isn't the right word because it gives them a sense of intention, but in being what they are, they oppose what they are not, and this is the nature of their identity. And everything is like this. The identity of everything is in this dynamic opposition. Now, Hegel makes up words for these, applies words for this. When he talks about what something is, in this case, my example, white, it's a thesis. When he talks about the opposing force, right, the thing that's going against it, it's an antithesis. So, thesis, antithesis. And the thesis and the antithesis are in a dynamic, rational opposition to one another. This is the way in which identity of all things work. You are what you are, both by being you and not being what you are not, right? The United States is what it is by being what it is and not being what it's not. Mathematics is, love is, cherry Coke is. I mean, anything that has identity is ennui, right? The emotion of ennui. Any of these things are. Now, that might simply stand as it was if it were not for the fact that these oppositions, these apparent contradictions, are, like I was saying, dynamic. They're shifting, they're changing, they're happening. They are slipping into the future, to quote a song from the 1970s. They are finding a way in which to push themselves forward and literally realize themselves in the world. What happens with black and white in the dynamic opposition between one another? Well, they contradict one another and form, from thesis white and antithesis black, a synthesis, or a synthesis, a combination of the two, gray. And with this new identity, gray, you have a new thesis, a new way of being, a new entity in the world that has an opposition. What's the opposition? Colors, right? So there's gray, there's colors, and then these form new oppositions, shades, I suppose, on like that. One of the things that's important to realize with this is you might say, well, I don't think there's any particular time that black and white and color and shades came into the world. They've always been there. And Hegel would say, no, of course there's no time that they came into the world. Rather, what it is, though, is that there's it's the rational order, the ratioizing of them, this proportioning of dynamic opposition that allows them to be. I know this is kind of extensive, but the thing you got to realize is that everything that is in a state, for Hegel, of evolving. And not just evolving physically, that's the most superficial aspect of it. It's evolving conceptually. It's evolving rationally. It is moving towards what Hegel calls the idea, the pure, absolute possibility of all things being realized in their totality, right? Everything that is in this dynamic opposition that's moving towards that. Couple terms to introduce now with regard to this, and these terms are dialectic and history. Dialectic. Dialectic is in many ways kind of the easy term here. Hegel's not the only philosopher who used dialectic. Lots of philosophers have done this from Plato onwards, but dialectic means basically reasoning in a matter analogous to dialogue. So I say this, you say this, I say this, you say this. That's a dialectic. Well, this dynamic rational opposition between entities, right? This is dialectical. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis, new thesis, antithesis, synthesis. That's dialectic. That's Hegel's dialectic. And that process of moving through through identity, that is what Hegel calls history. Very important concept here, because history for Hegel is not just what happened yesterday or last week or last year or 100 years ago or whatever. History is for Hegel a force. It is the rational force of all of these entities within the dialectic, all these theses within the dialectic, evolving, literally realizing their possibility in this dynamic opposition with one another. That's what they are. And they're evolving towards infinity. They're evolving towards what Hegel calls the whole idea. So, what do we got here? Well, we got rationality, we got dialectic, we have history, and finally we have the idea. The idea. What is the idea? The idea is what all history is moving towards. The idea is the totality of all possibilities that may be realized within this dialectical process. Because here's the thing. You can see, if you think about this, that there are all sorts of concepts that have a kind of potential for being expressed at some point within this dialectical process, but can't be yet. You know, white's got the possibility of color in it, yeah, sure. But that color can't, when you're just thinking about white, well, it can't come out quite yet. It has to go through a few different dynamic oppositions, right? Till you get to the black, and you get the gray, and then there's the color, and then there's the shades, and then all these things. And then at that point, as it's evolved, the idea of color in relation to white comes in. Well, in the same way that that's what the possibility is with regard to colors and light and shade and so forth, the evolution of the concept of light and white, so it is that any concept is in a state of evolution. Let me repeat that. Any concept, such as it's real, is in a state of evolution for Hegel. It's an evolution within the dialectic. It's an evolution within history. It has these possibilities, but these possibilities have to be realized rationally. And the total possibility, that the totality of any single thing, that any or any the entire possibility of all identity within any concept is held within the idea. That's the that infinitely far away condition that makes it possible for all things to be. Hegel calls this the thought in the mind of God, borrowing largely from, I suppose, from Aristotle, although I don't know that he would admit that. But he's saying that there is this way that every single entity is moving towards that end, moving towards realization, and must have that end to move towards. So history is this rational dance of concepts coming to be what they can be in the face of history. It is understanding ourselves within that and through that we begin to have a concept of what, or a sense of what the role of art and aesthetic theory is with that. And I'll get to that with the next lecture.